It was a crisp Thursday evening when the stage lights came up on one of the most highly anticipated televised political forums of the year. The set was designed to be neutral, a modern studio space, sleek and minimal, with a deep blue backdrop, and subtle flags of the United States hanging behind the panelists. The theme of the night's discussion was leadership, loyalty, and personal values in American politics. It was supposed to be a balanced, issue-driven debate. But 20 minutes into the broadcast, the tone of the conversation veered unexpectedly and dramatically. Jasmine Crockett, the sharp-tongued, unflinching Democratic Congresswoman from Texas, was seated across from J.D. Vance, the freshman Republican senator from Ohio. He had been fielding questions about his unwavering support for former President Donald Trump, particularly on the topic of loyalty and leadership. His answers, though polished and consistent with his previous public appearances, were met with skeptical looks from across the table. But Crockett wasn't just skeptical. She was loaded for the moment. As the moderator transitioned into a segment about trust and integrity in public office, J.D. made a point that seemed to trigger something in her. He stated, calmly and confidently, that Donald Trump's loyalty to the American people had never been in question, and that despite criticisms about his personal life, he had proven again and again that he kept his promises, whether it was about trade, immigration, or the economy. Jasmine didn't jump in immediately. She let the silence hang for a beat, just long enough to feel deliberate, and then adjusted her microphone with the kind of casual control that says, I'm about to change the temperature in this room. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed on J.D., and said with a tone that was both surgical and unapologetic, it's really interesting to hear about loyalty from someone defending a man whose own marriage was in crisis while he held the highest office in the land. The air shifted. You could hear the change in the room. The other panelists went still, and even the moderator blinked in surprise. Jasmine, however, wasn't finished. We're talking about leadership, right? Integrity, trust. The man you're defending reportedly had to renegotiate a prenup with his own wife while sitting in the Oval Office, because even she wasn't sure he'd do right by her. That's not loyalty. That's a red flag in neon lights. It was a moment no one saw coming. Not the producers, not the other lawmakers, and not J.D. Vance. The panel had been fiery. Before, plenty of talking points and partisan digs, but this was different. This wasn't policy. This was personal. Crockett's claim, while unconfirmed by any official source, referenced long-standing rumors that had floated around tabloids and political gossip circles. That Melania Trump, known for her measured distance and carefully crafted appearances during Trump's presidency, had quietly insisted on revising the terms of her financial agreement with him during his term in office. Whether or not the details were true almost didn't matter in that moment. What mattered was the intent behind the statement. Crockett was making it clear that, in her view, personal loyalty, or the lack of it, reflected directly on a person's fitness to lead. And she wasn't simply stating it as a throwaway line. It was calculated, framed within the broader discussion of leadership and integrity. She made the connection between private behavior and public consequence. How can a man lead a nation, she added, when he can't even lead his own home? With honesty, the moderator, visibly tense, attempted to steer the conversation back to broader topics. Let's keep the discussion policy-centered, he interjected, but Jasmine didn't flinch. She held her ground, noting that personal values were inseparable from political choices, that a leader who couldn't be trusted in his private life shouldn't automatically be trusted with the country's future. For J.D. Vance, who had spent months building his public image around loyalty to Trump and populist values, the moment was a direct challenge to the narrative he'd carefully upheld. Crockett's words didn't just poke holes in Trump's personal history, they threatened the foundation of J.D.'s defense of him. And for a brief few seconds, as the cameras kept rolling and the studio lights remained bright, no one said a word, because everyone knew the debate had just taken a turn no one would forget. J.D. Vance sat still for a moment, staring across the table, his face a mask of tight restraint. The jab Jasmine Crockett had just thrown wasn't just political, it was personal, and it struck at the heart of a figure he'd tied his political future to, Donald Trump. J.D. had heard attacks on Trump before, dozens, maybe hundreds, but this felt different. It wasn't about indictments or policies. This time, it was about Trump's marriage, his household, his character behind closed doors. And J.D. knew that once a conversation turned toward family, it rarely ended well. At first, he didn't respond. The silence after Crockett's remarks stretched uncomfortably, and for a moment it looked like J.D. might simply let it slide. That was the smart political move. After Eldon, take the bait, pivot to the issues, rise above. But then, Crockett doubled down. She shifted in her chair, still composed, and added with a slight shake of her head, look, I'm not trying to be sensational, but let's not pretend like these things don't matter. If we're going to praise someone's leadership, we can't ignore the way they treat the people closest to them. If your own spouse needs legal protection to trust you, what does that say? The moderator tensed up again. J.D.'s eyes narrowed, Asterisk, he reached for his microphone, adjusted it slowly, and finally spoke, his voice measured but heavy. No, Congresswoman, there's a difference between policy debate and personal attacks, and I'm honestly shocked that you're dragging someone's marriage into a national conversation on leadership. Asterisk, Crockett responded almost instantly, her tone even. It's not a personal attack. It's a question of judgment. And if you're going to build your entire argument around the character of a man, then we get to look at the whole picture. Asterisk, that was when JD's composure began to fray. Asterisk, he leaned in slightly, not shouting, but speaking with unmistakable force. I find it incredibly hypocritical that you'd accuse someone of lacking integrity based on rumors about their marriage, when your own party has stood behind people with well-documented ethical failures. We're here to talk about what impacts the American people, not what happens behind someone's closed doors. Asterisk, Crockett replied, calm but firm. But that's the thing, Senator. What happens behind closed doors does impact the American people when it shapes decisions, policies, and how someone handles pressure. Leadership doesn't start on a podium, it starts at home. Asterisk, JD shook his head, the frustration now visibly creeping in. He pressed his fingers together, took a breath, and said, if we're going to reduce every conversation about leadership to gossip about someone's marriage, then we're doing a disservice to the American people. You can dislike Trump's style, you can hate his policies, but trying to undermine his legacy by dragging his wife into it, that's not politics. That's tabloid trash. Asterisk, the exchange had clearly gone beyond the bounds of typical political sparring. J.D. Vance, who normally kept his tone deliberate and restrained, was clearly rattled, and while he never raised his voice, the irritation was written all over his body language. His jaw clenched, his posture stiffer, his responses sharper with each round. It was the first time many viewers had seen him genuinely lose patience. On air, Asterisk, Crockett wasn't visibly fazed. She maintained eye contact and let JD's frustration do most of the talking. She had made her point, and now he was reacting exactly what she may have intended. Asterisk, for JD, it wasn't just about defending Trump, it was about defending a broader narrative. He had built his political rise on being a voice for traditional values, loyalty, and authenticity. Crockett's remarks didn't just criticize Trump, they threatened the entire moral framework JD claimed to represent, and that's why it struck so deep. To let those comments go unchallenged would have felt, to him, like conceding something far greater than a debate point. Asterisk, the moderator attempted again to steer the conversation back to economic policy, but the atmosphere had already shifted. The temperature in the room had risen, and so had the stakes. What began as a panel on leadership had turned into a high-stakes duel over the boundaries of political discourse, in J.D. Vance, typically a master of staying on message, had found himself pulled into a conversation he never wanted to have. Asterisk, the air in the studio felt heavier than usual. What had started as a structured, policy-centered conversation was now teetering on the edge of something far more personal and uncomfortable. The moderator, a veteran journalist known for managing high-pressure panels, shuffled his notes awkwardly and glanced toward the control room. It was clear he hadn't anticipated this. Asterisk, J.D. Vance sat with his hands folded tightly in front of him, staring straight ahead. The previous exchange with Jasmine Crockett had shaken the atmosphere in the room, but it was the silence that followed that truly made the moment land. The cameras kept rolling, capturing not just words, but facial expressions, tension, discomfort at the kind of quiet drama that even scripted television rarely achieved. Asterisk, Crockett had just doubled down on her claim that Donald Trump's marriage, specifically reports of a renegotiated prenup during his presidency, reflected on his character as a leader. JD had tried to respond with controlled indignation, pushing back with words like tabloid trash and accusing her of dragging politics into the gutter. But even as he spoke, there was something different about his tone of sharpness. A twitch in his jaw, the kind of body language that said this had gotten personal. Asterisk, the moderator attempted to smooth things over. Let's refocus. Senator Vance, Congresswoman Crockett, we understand this is a passionate discussion, but let's return to the broader question. What do Americans expect from their leaders when it comes to personal integrity? Asterisk, he was trying to salvage the conversation, but it was already clear that the audience, both in the studio and watching at home, had felt the pivot. This wasn't just about personal integrity anymore. It was about boundaries, and whether they had just been crossed on live television. Asterisk, J.D. Vance adjusted his microphone again, slower this time. He cleared his throat and answered the moderator with a calm tone, though it lacked the warmth and polish from earlier in the segment. I think Americans are tired of politicians tearing each other down with personal attacks. They want solutions to inflation, border security, a national debate over someone's prenup. Asterisk, it was a reasonable response, but his voice carried a cold edge, and his eyes didn't leave Crockett. There was no longer any attempt to hide the irritation. Asterisk, Crockett, ever composed, nodded along as he spoke, but the smirk at the corner of her mouth suggested she knew exactly what she'd done. She'd forced a reaction out of someone who rarely gave one. Asterisk, the audience in the studio was dead quiet. No coughs, no shifting chairs, just a room frozen in real time. Even the other panelists, who had been active earlier in the discussion, were now silent observers. No one wanted to interrupt the rising tension between the two central figures. Asterisk 4. The viewers at home, the moment felt raw and scripted in the most human way. There wasn't a shouting match or a dramatic walk-off. Instead, there was something more unsettling. Two politicians, locked in ideological and personal conflict, neither willing to back down. J.D. Vance, who had built his public image on the idea of principled conservatism and Midwestern calm, had found himself defending a man who, as Crockett insinuated, may have failed in the most personal of responsibilities, his marriage, and Crockett, armed with both strategy and provocation, had leveraged that very accusation to throw Vance off balance. Asterisk, producers behind the scenes were reportedly scrambling during the commercial break. The show's staff didn't know whether to lean into the moment or pivot hard away from it. On one hand, the exchange was already trending online, clips being cut and shared in real time. On the other, it raised serious questions about whether the line between personal and political had just been shattered on national television. Asterisk, by the time the broadcast returned from break, the mood had shifted dramatically. J.D. Vance spoke in shorter sentences, more cautious now, perhaps realizing the trap that had been set. Crockett, meanwhile, seemed to know the upper hand was hers, not because she had won the debate on policy, but because she had introduced something bigger than policy, discomfort. She had made the audience think, not about legislation, but about the people behind the podiums. Asterisk, and that was the shock more than words. More than politics, it was watching a live audience, a television host, and even seasoned lawmakers be caught off guard by how fast things can change when someone decides to say the quiet part out loud. Asterisk, the fallout from the televised exchange between J.D. Vance and Jasmine Crockett spread faster than either of them likely anticipated. Within minutes of the segment airing, clips began circulating online. Not the kind of clips that focus on policy, sound bites, or economic proposals, but the kind that get people talking, passion, tension, conflict. The moment Crockett brought up Donald Trump's alleged prenup renegotiation and J.D. Vance's visible reaction to it became the instant centerpiece of political discourse across social media and cable news alike. Asterisk, by the next morning, the video had gone viral. Hashtags like hashtag Crockett vs Vance and hashtag Marriage Matters were trending across platforms. On TikTok, users dissected every frame of JD's body language's tightening jaw. The pause before he responded, the brief flash of something more than political irritation. Twitter, as always, was divided. Some praised Crockett for holding Vance accountable for romanticizing Trump, while others accused her of crossing a line and weaponizing private matters for political gain. Asterisk, cable news networks replayed the moment on loop, each adding its own spin. Conservative outlets blasted Crockett's comments as unprofessional and mean-spirited, while liberal panels argued that it was fair game, especially since J.D. had centered his defense of Trump on character and loyalty. J.D. Vance, for his part, kept his official response minimal. During an early morning podcast appearance, he simply said, "I think there's a difference between healthy political debate and dragging someone's family into it. I don't think it helps the country, and I don't think the American people want that kind of politics." Asterisk, but the conversation had already outgrown the initial interview. Journalists, commentators, and voters began asking a broader question: where's the line? When does a political figure's personal life become relevant? And more specifically, when a politician builds their brand on someone else's character. Is it fair for opponents to examine that character from all angles, even the private ones? Asterisk, J.D. Vance became the reluctant center of this debate, not because of anything he said during the segment, but because of how he reacted. The subtle frustration, the rare break from his usual calmness told viewers something real was touched, and real moments are rare in modern politics. Asterisk, in town halls and coffee shops across Ohio, his constituents weighed in. Some believed he handled himself with class, trying to steer the discussion back to policy and avoid sinking into tabloid territory. Others, however, questioned why he'd react so defensively if the claims about Trump's marriage had no merit. For a few days, it wasn't about Trump or Crockett. It was about J.D. how he responded, what he stood for, and whether his loyalty was clouding his judgment. Asterisk, in Washington, the incident sparked conversations among lawmakers behind closed doors. Some were concerned that debates were becoming too personal, that the line between political accountability and personal attacks was dissolving. Others felt that transparency, especially around public figures who wield enormous power, had to include personal behavior. Asterisk, J.D., meanwhile, kept his public comments brief but firm. In a radio interview later that week, he said, "We're going to look back on this moment and ask whether it moved the country forward or backward. Did it teach our kids how to argue ideas? Or did it just give them another excuse to tear people down?" Asterisk, that line was widely quoted and even praised across party lines. It was classic Vance reflective, rooted in moral argument, but it didn't erase what had happened. The debate had left a mark, not just on his public image, but on the broader cultural moment. Asterisk late-night hosts got in on the moment too, poking fun at the awkward tension between the two lawmakers. One comedian quipped, "When your whole political identity is I stand with Trump, and someone points out that even Melania had second thoughts, you might need to come up with a backup slogan." Asterisk, despite the mockery, the moment triggered serious questions. Voters and commentators alike began asking, is there any such thing as an off-limits topic when you're defending someone as publicly scrutinized as Donald Trump? And if J.D. Vance wants to build his political philosophy around that legacy, is it fair to examine all aspects of it, including the ones he wishes would stay private? Asterisk, the segment had intended to explore the theme of leadership and loyalty. Ironically, it became a case study in both. J.D. Vance didn't explode or storm off, but his visible discomfort, his clipped tone, and his sharp rebuttals gave Americans something to think about: what loyalty means, what boundaries remain in public life, and how far someone will go to defend not just a man, but a myth. Asterisk. The broadcast eventually wrapped, but the conversation it ignited showed no signs of slowing down. In homes, offices, and digital spaces across the country, people weren't just debating Donald Trump or Jasmine Crockett, they were reflecting on J.D. Vance's reaction, the tone of modern political discourse, and the increasingly thin line between private life and public leadership. What began as a forum on values had ended up becoming a cultural flashpoint. Asterisk for J.D. Vance. The moment served as a reminder of the weight that comes with aligning oneself so closely with a polarizing figure. His defense of Trump had always been framed around policy achievements and ideological alignment, but Crockett's challenge introduced a different dimension, one that called into question the very personal aspects of the man Vance had championed. J.D.'s frustration, his rare visible irritation, revealed something human, a man who felt a boundary had been crossed, but also one who may have underestimated the extent to which political loyalty can come with unpredictable costs. Asterisk, Jasmine Crockett, on the other hand, walked away from the exchange with heightened visibility. For her supporters, she was a truth-teller, unafraid to confront uncomfortable truths and call out perceived hypocrisy. For critics, she was reckless, blurring ethical lines and turning personal matters into political weapons. Yet regardless of the stance people took, no one could deny that she had stirred the pot in a way few politicians managed to do in such short bursts of airtime. Asterisk. The larger public was left wrestling with questions that transcend party lines. What is fair in political debate? When someone builds their platform on the character of another, should all aspects of that character be open to scrutiny? And in the age of constant media, where every second is recorded, dissected, and memed, much of a person's private life remains truly private. Asterisk. The incident also laid bare a growing trend, the personalization of politics. Leaders are no longer judged solely by their legislative records or policy positions. In an era where politics is entertainment and every debate is a potential viral moment, personal, characterial, or perceived has become a central battleground. J.D. Vance stepped into that arena with confidence, but this moment revealed how quickly control can slip away when the conversation veers into unexpected territory. Asterisk. In the days that followed, both lawmakers returned to their usual routines, attending hearings, posting carefully worded statements, and moving forward with their respective agendas. But for those who watched that live exchange, the memory lingered. Not because of shouting or scandal, but because of what it revealed: a flash of vulnerability, a crack in the usual script, a moment where political theater gave way to something undeniably real. Asterisk. And in that moment, the country wasn't watching a policy debate. It was watching two people, two visions, and